I thought what I would do is just explain just a few seconds about the S8 Nations initiative, because it's probably the first time a lot of you have heard about it. So I have a couple slides here. Can you see those, Julia? Or?
No.
So I think, as we see, it's a bit of a difficult time to be a large nation. If you see what's happening with the United States, or what's happening with the UK, etc. So a lot of these large countries are struggling. So we did quite a lot of work around successful small nations, and we found that these small countries actually achieve substantially greater competitiveness, but they just don't seem to have the voice. I think also, if you look at the trajectory across lots of different metrics, competitiveness, Gini coefficients, CO2 emissions, etc., it's these smaller countries which are ascending, and the larger countries are struggling. And the fact is that a lot of these smaller countries are more laboratories. They're not utopias, so they're much more subject to experimentation. They're subject to exogenous forces. So it's not surprising that you see people like on the panel today who are really at the forefront of what's happening in terms of innovation. So this just goes to show you, for example, small countries attending WEF. It's very much dominated by large countries, so it's quite difficult to get the voice that one probably deserves given the level of achievement. So I think the idea around S8 was that we felt that there's just a number of really important problems that are imminent and require pretty bold thinking, imaginative thinking, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate. The fact that we're living to be 100 years old, probably 15 years ago was a possibility, but now it's a distinct probability. Immigration, reproduction rates, etc. So these are all pretty serious problems, and we need to come together and come up with more creative, bold ideas on how we can deal with this, and what better way than to get these small countries who seem to be leading the way in a number of fronts and also tend to be very collaborative in nature. So that's what the basic idea of S8 is to bring these people together. And we have Heng Chee, one of our delegates from Singapore. We have Jan, who's one of our delegates from Helsinki, and people around this table who can actually sort of speak from experience about what they're doing, and this is what we hope to achieve. It's a lot of it's about experimentation. To progress, you have to experiment, and this is what we're trying to encourage as well. And what we'd like to do is to focus on really the best practices and to have a positive example. There's a lot of complaining, there's a lot of brick throwing, but there's also a lot of good things happening out there. And if we can, as a group, identify some of these things that are really positive improvements and shed a light on those, then that's in and of itself quite an important thing to do. So I think that's a bit the background. We have these are examples of people who form part of our delegations. There's lots more information on the website, but that's not what you came here together for. We're going to turn it over to the people, and I'll give it back to you, Alice, and you can take it from there.
Thank you very much, James, for that opening. So what we're going to talk about today is the fact that, one, the majority of the world's population already lives in cities, and of course will live in cities post-COVID. Two, recognizing that our cities often have similar problems, albeit the solutions need to be contextualized because each city has a different context. So what we're going to be looking at is some of the urban innovation that has been applied in the cities of, for example, Singapore, Helsinki, and Copenhagen to solve some of the critical challenges that they're facing. And of course, we do know that urban innovation is particularly necessary today as the Internet of Things is spearheading a new wave of experimentation. And we must try different approaches to try and solve some of the critical problems that we have. But first of all, we want to hear from Carlo Ratti from MIT. He's the director of the Sensible Cities Lab in MIT. If I could ask Carlo in the first instance, just to tell us a little bit about where the concept of smart cities came from. We know that it's been around already for about 15 years. And to try and explain what exactly smart cities is. So Carlo, do you want to answer that question for me, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alice. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Well, the concept of smart cities intimately linked with something that we've been discussing a lot within the WEF, the World Economic Forum framework, and that's, the fourth industrial revolution. If you want, it's nothing else than the consequence of the internet becoming Internet of Things, entering physical space, and hence changing the way we can understand cities, especially through data, the way we can analyze the data, and finally design and live in cities in a different way. So somehow the same phenomenon, if you think about smart cities, the same phenomenon when you look at industries, again, fourth industrial revolution, when you look at homes, is smart homes, but it's really part of this convergence between the digital and the physical world. And here I wanted to say something to build on what Alice, you were saying, and what James was saying, is, experimentation is very, very important. Today, urban innovation needs a lot of urban tech, new technologies that are changing, for instance, the way we move. Think about how over the past few years we've seen ride sharing, car sharing, micromobility, many innovations that are supposed to continue if you think about self-driving cars in the next years. So more and more urban tech. And then the way urban tech works is in a very simple way, is based on trial and error. Like, what happens with VC funds, what happens in Silicon Valley, what happens in every innovation ecosystem is you try something and you see what works, what doesn't work. Well, however, that's not really how cities operate. Cities really look at something different. They really want to plan for the long term, and they will look at the past in order to look at best practices and then try to implement them. So what we've seen over the past few years is kind of a clash between the way of operating of urban tech, take a new micromobility solution like scooters and flood the city with scooters, and the city which is not very able to cope with the change. However, I think the interesting thing here is that the pandemic is teaching us, has taught cities a different way to operate. During the pandemic, the need to respond very quickly to a crisis meant that many cities started implementing as well this kind of trial and error approach. It means, that maybe a closing a street or pedestrianizing part of the city or doing a new bicycle path, things that maybe had been in the process and been discussed for like a decade, were implemented in just a few weeks. And with the knowledge that that might not be perfect, but you try and then you fix it over time. And I think that approach, the trial and error approach, which is kind of something that every city, and I think we'll hear more from other cities today, but every city had to implement during the pandemic, hopefully could say in the long term, it could actually help find a better match between urban tech and urban evolution as urban innovation in general as framed by municipal government. So somehow, I hope that this lesson from the pandemic is something that will stay with us in cities around the world.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn to Professor Heng Chee from Singapore University for Technology and Design to tell us a little bit about what Singapore has been doing, some of the smart solutions that you've been employing. And perhaps you might tell us a little bit about the digital twin solution that you've been employing as well. Heng Chee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'd like to take up a bit from what James has said and Carlo has said to set the context. Smart nations, small nations really are inventive and innovative. And if you look through history, they are the first, to adopt new ideas, new solutions. New Zealand too, one of those, because they started taking away Social Security and coming up with the superannuation and coming up with new ideas. So for some reason, smaller nations dare to change. And I would say in the case of Singapore, we are really a micro-state, city-state, nation-state. And the city has many constraints, land constraint, no resources. We think and anticipate problems all the time. So we have to be smart because we have to use technology to augment our resources when you have no resources. And because cities, the urban environment is getting more and more complex, we realize that you have to use technology to help you forward. I dare say that for small nations to be smart, to use smart technology, to use technology based on knowledge, the knowledge-based technologies is a necessity. It is not a virtue. We've got to go that way. And Singapore has been going that way. And so right in the 1980s, we already went smart. And how did we do it? Before I get to the digital twin, which is so 21st century, you know, in the 1980s, as a small nation, Singapore decided you have no resources. You really have to computerize and harness what is this new IT, ICT technology. And we did one smart thing. The whole civil service was given a computer each civil service. We computerized the civil service so you don't have resistance from anyone. And it became so easy to digitalize services and the whole of government. And we had e-government, e-tax filing, and that was the beginning. And after that, we just adopted more and more solutions. And there are so many things I can talk of, and it could come out in the questions. But let me go quickly to the digital twin, because now we've moved on. I don't want to talk about the smart technologies which we've used in the pandemic, which is important, because I think it will be spoken of by others. So let me just say that right now we are moving so fast that we've come up with a digital twin of the city. It is virtual Singapore. In other words, a 3D model of Singapore has been created. And it is amazing. And I've looked at this, you know, you look at this model and every street, every building, every road, every lamppost, every tree, lake, whatever, is captured there. And it is a wonderful tool for urban planners, for decision makers, for academics to work and study with it, because you can simulate and to test out a lot of problems. For instance, you know, and real life data, real time data is passed on. Of course, this model is a platform. Think of it as a data platform. It works because all the agencies pump in data, and your sensors collect data, you send in the data. So if you want to find out about heat islands, you want to find out about airflows, the microclimate of a certain constituency or even a neighborhood, you can immediately plug on. What is it for? You can bring in people participation. Our planners think they can help people imagine. You bring them to the neighborhood. This is your neighborhood. And this is what we will do. If we suddenly build 3 blocks of flats of apartments, which are 25-story high, this is what it looks like. And then people will say, oh my God, I don't want it. If you take away some of your roads, this is what will happen. So you can imagine that. And it's very useful in so many ways. I've been told, for instance, you can focus on a neighborhood. This 3D model is not just one big model of Singapore city. You can zoom in to the neighborhood and zoom in on the buildings. And you pick out all your buildings with the same height in the neighborhood and say, okay, I want to put up solar panels. Let's find out same height buildings. How are the buildings angled? How much of the sun do they catch? And how much sunlight will there be? Process it and you know how much energy you capture. So you can see the potential for planners. And there are so many other things that can be done. But I think I'll stop here to let someone else speak. But this digital twin is for planners, it's for businesses, because you can plan business. This is information. And the government of Singapore will share this with the people, with the business themselves, and also with people. But I think there are different levels of data that they will release. And for the government agencies, far more data they can access, business up to a point, and the people, what will be, for public consumption. So I'll just stop there, but we are using this new tool for making decisions, for planning, and finding the path forward.
Thank you very much, Heng Chee. I find that fascinating because I guess, we're increasingly hearing how industry is, leveraging digital twin technology to design the buildings of the future and the places of the future. And rightly so, but of course cities need to be able to interpret what they're designing. So it's imperative that cities do develop their own digital twin. Recently, Singapore was named as the smartest city in the world by the IMD Index, and second was the city of Helsinki. So I think that's a perfect segue to bring in our mayor of Helsinki, Jan Vapaavuori, to tell us a little bit about what the city of Helsinki has been doing. And I know you're particularly committed to digitalization and data and AI to find a new path to the new normal. So Jan, perhaps you might tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in Helsinki.
Thank you, Alice. I'd like to start by saying that it's just so lovely to be on a panel together with people from Singapore and Copenhagen. And let me tell you why. Because when I took office 3.5 years ago, my first task was to draft a new strategy for the city. And I started by creating the topic for it, how to brand the city of Helsinki. And my first idea was to brand it as the greenest or most sustainable city in the world. But then I found out that it was already reserved by the city of Copenhagen. My second idea was to brand it as the smartest city in the world. And then I found out that that was reserved and taken already by the city of Singapore. So I needed to be innovative and to create something totally new. And then I ended up, and I'm happy that the city council agreed with me that we branded the city and named the whole strategy as the most functional city in the world. For us, above all else, functionality means a convenient everyday life for its citizens. And of course, in order to be functional, you also need to be sustainable, and you also need to be smart, you need to be resilient, you actually need to be very, very, very much. You could say that COVID-19 has challenged this mission. Throughout of our managing the crisis, we have understood that the road to so-called new normal is not to change course, but to keep investing into the crucial city development areas we already identified before the crisis. And one of the cornerstones is making this mission reality is new technology, digitalization, data, and AI, as mentioned by you, Alice. We believe that by fully harnessing the potential of digitalization, Helsinki can make day-to-day life easier, so the city more functional, both for its customers, residents, visitors, businesses, communities, and its employees and decision makers. At its finest, tomorrow's Helsinki will be able to predict and respond to customers' needs in a more personalized way. The new normal will give people more time to live their lives, be creative and innovative, less time in queues or meaningless bureaucracy. If we can give people even 15 minutes more quality time each day, I think that we have succeeded. For this purpose, I hired a chief digital officer, set up a new department for digitalization and data, and launched an ambitious digitalization program that will help the city improve its services and renew its operations. The changes encompass not only new technologies, but also the innovation culture, organization, management, and staff skills within the organization. We also put a lot of resources into rebuilding our digital infrastructure base. Leading cities around the world are seeking out best practices. Helsinki works closely with cities such as our neighbors, Stockholm, Copenhagen, but also cities like New York and London to make the most of the opportunities provided by artificial intelligence, data, and digital innovation. Our main focus areas are the right services at the right time, developing better services together with people, making full use of data and putting people in charge of their data, bringing tools and infrastructure up to date, and supporting leadership, competence building, and structural changes. With digitalization, we believe we can make Helsinki the most functional city in the world. Without that, we would not have a chance. This requires focus not only, and I think this is important, this requires focus not only on individual programs or service development, but realizing the position and power of new technologies in everything we do, from urban mobility to healthcare. Only by putting technology, digitalization and AI in the core of everything we do, it has the opportunity to realize its full potential and provide a sustainable route to new normal, whatever it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And you mentioned, of course, that when you were thinking about how you were going to brand your city, that you discovered that Copenhagen was the most sustainable city in the world. And if we turn to Marius, of course, from the city of Copenhagen, Marius, we all know that Copenhagen has this ambition to be carbon neutral, I should say. I was going to say net zero carbon neutral by 2025. And it plans to be the first city in the world to be carbon neutral, and that's a very ambitious target. And of course, Jan City, yours is 2035. Is that correct? You want to be carbon neutral? Yep, 2035. So maybe, Marius, if you could tell us a little bit about how you've been using technology as an enabler of realizing this ambition in the city of Copenhagen, and particularly tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been leading in relation to air pollution. Marius, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Alice. So obviously Copenhagen is quite ambitious on this agenda, and I guess being among these great panelists and talking about small cities and smaller nation states, I guess being from the Nordics would for me imply that we have like certain opportunities. I guess we have a very high level of trust in the Nordic countries. We have a low power distance, high level of equality, and economic and social, obviously, and also a quite high digital maturity. So we have opportunities. I guess we also have obligations. And for the city of Copenhagen, we commissioned this goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2025. And well, it's some years ago we came up with the idea, and back then it seemed to be like far away in a distant future, and now we were actually getting there. So it's only in a few years' time. So people are working around the clock to get to this end goal. And I guess we have had a couple of roadmaps leading us to where we are now, and some of the stuff that was done earlier on was to do with energy and the transformation of the energy sector, basically using biomass, stuff like that in our power plants. But now it's getting increasingly difficult. So now we're looking into issues such as mobility, and I guess for states and especially for cities, mobility is such an important issue. You really have to be able to get your citizens to travel freely in whatever means of transportation they would prefer, and at the same time we want to cut carbon emissions. Obviously, actually we're trying now to close down the inner city of Copenhagen for cars, and that is a huge challenge for us, and could be an interesting use case to discuss in the future. Because how do you actually ensure that you have a lot of activities, you have people, that the city is lively, even though you will ban cars from going into the center of the city? That's a huge challenge that we're working on at the moment. I guess working with this green agenda is very much about using technology, and so technology is not the end goal. We don't compete to be the smartest city in the world. Actually, we compete to having the highest quality of life, or to have happy citizens and stuff like that. So technology for us, it's a way of accelerating the green transition and for reaching some of the goals that we're working on. So I guess we are going to get to carbon neutrality by 2025, but even that is just like a small step, actually, because as you mentioned, net zero, and at the end of the day in 2025 we will still emit greenhouse gases, and there will still be pollution in the air, and I guess the next challenge for us would be to look at some of these issues, for instance, around the clean air in neighborhoods. I guess that is really a global problem. The air in Copenhagen and surrounding areas are fairly clean, but in general, people living in cities are dying 2 years ahead of time. So it's really a grave problem. And now we started just slowly working with the IoT and sensors to find out, would that be an opportunity to actually make certain that you have a data foundation for working with some of the issues around air quality. Because if you haven't got the data, it's very difficult to solve the problem. And given that air quality is a very local phenomenon, people don't really know much about it in general. We don't know what the level of air pollutants are in cities in general. So we recently started working with companies supplying sensors, but also working with large corps such as Google. Google has the advantage that they have this Google Studio car that goes around cities and would take pictures of streets, but we're using that for measuring the air quality actually here in Copenhagen. We had a map already of the air quality, and now data is being validated, and at the end of this year we will have like a real solid heat map, so to speak, of the level of air quality drilled down to individual streets and even buildings. So that will be very interesting to see. So what would actually be the problem? How would it look? How can we work on combating bad air in cities? How can we use that in our planning processes when we are finding out where to place schools and nurseries and kindergarten, stuff like that, for instance. So we are getting to carbon neutrality, but that is just a small part of solving this puzzle, and I'm hoping for us to discuss now or in future how to get to the next level. But that was just to say this from Copenhagen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. And I should have said at the beginning that, of course, you're the program director for the Copenhagen Solutions Lab. So thank you very much, Marius. I think what all of our speakers have highlighted is that technology is an enabler. It's not the be-all, end-all. So you're first focusing on what you want to solve in your city and then leveraging technology to help you solve that. And I think that's a critical thing that our audience need to bear in mind today. I'm very conscious of the backdrop of where cities are at right now. So we've had a public health emergency in cities around the world. And of course, that's had a very significant impact on the finances of our cities. And in one regard, I guess the worst is yet to come in relation to that. So, you know, we have seen revenues fall in relation to public transit, in relation to toll charges, parking charges, property taxes, and we're seeing investment returns fall. And on the other hand, expenses have increased in our cities in terms of health, sanitation, feeding families, etc. So in terms of cities who are thinking of embarking on this journey of solving some of their problems and leveraging technology to solve some of those problems, they of course will need to tread very carefully. And what we do know is that over the last 15 years, according to Cisco research, around 75% of smart city projects failed to get beyond the pilot stage. So what I'd like to explore in this next part of this webinar is just how we make this real. So how do we avoid smart city projects failing? How do we get to scale? I also would encourage our audience, if you have particular questions that you would like to pose, to please pop them into the chat. But I'm going to ask some of my questions in the intervening time. Carlo, if I could first turn to you, just in relation to what I just said, you know, that Cisco found that around 75% of smart cities projects failed to scale. Could you perhaps highlight why you believe that has been happening and some ways to overcome that challenge to get to scale?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alice. I remember the statistic by Cisco, but I think, you know, we need to be to really define better, as we were doing before, exactly what is a smart city project. Because if you think that a smart city project is also what's happening with the new startups and the private sector, think about, you know, how Uber or Lyft or Didi in China, Ola and so on, these kind of companies that change a lot and transform mobility in our cities, you know, certainly they've been able to scale up even, perhaps even too much, you know, to becoming almost monopoly on the global stage. So I think if I'm not wrong, the the statistics by by Cisco was referring primarily to municipal-led smart city projects. And I think there some of the issues might be really related to what we were saying before, to this ability to do trial and error. You know, you need to try something, do a pilot, and then from there to step up and, you know, go to the next level, and then get scale as you progress. And I think, as we were saying, the traditional way of thinking and operating of municipalities is not too conducive to this this way of doing things. And perhaps what we learned during the pandemics can actually help in order to take a small project like you do in VC. You try something, then, you know, when that works out, then you give it additional funding and you go to the next level. And after 2 or 3 rounds with feedback loops, then you can really be at scale. I want to add, however, an additional point here that certainly when you're doing this and getting feedback loop, if you do innovation a traditional way like VC, think about Silicon Valley model, or if you do it in a city, there's one key difference, which is citizens. So the important thing would be to really bring citizens in the loop and allowing them to help decide what type of city they want tomorrow. You might have something that works from an economic point of view, but it doesn't mean that it is what really citizens want. And so I would say that this trial and error approach, if coupled with feedback from citizens, could really be what helps scale up much more when you think about smart city municipal-led innovation.
Thank you very much. And we have 3 cities that have, of course, provided wonderful examples of how they've actually got to success. I would be interested in understanding how you got there. So, you know, the enabling policy that you created, for example, the financing models, the business models, the partnerships. So it's a general question that I'm going to ask of all of you. So maybe if I start with Jan, and then I will turn to Marius and to Heng Chee. Jan, how did you get to success in the city of Helsinki?
To be honest, I think that my problem is that too few pilots actually have failed. And I think that the challenge in my culture is that people are a little bit too risk averse. But I think the big picture, and trying to respond to your question, I don't know whether we are that much better than anyone else, but I believe in 2 things which I have tried to systematically take forward in my city. The first one is that you need to train and educate the management, broadly speaking, in the city all the time. And what we did, for example, was a mandatory course, mandatory training in AI for the whole middle management in the whole city. And I think it's like important, especially with new technologies, that the bigger percentage of leading civil servants in this city understand what you're talking about, have a clue, have an idea what AI actually is about, what it may solve. It gives a better start for a pilot where a broader team is like committed to it, and a broader team is like understanding the challenges and opportunities you have in a pilot, in order to avoid the problem we often have, that it's also a dedicated engineer in somewhere in some department in the city discussing with some service provider, another engineer, and at the same time those who actually should take advantage of the pilot, the new innovation, are quite far away from the exercise itself. And the second one is a little bit what Carlo Ratti already mentioned, that we believe in a co-creation idea from as early beginning as possible, together with the business society, together with the citizens, together with anyone, and taking as many stakeholders on board in a as early stage as possible gives a better chance to any pilot to succeed, but also gives us the possibility to stop and close a pilot which won't succeed in an earlier stage.
Thank you very much, Jan. So hearing the importance of building capacity within the city authority, and very much from the very beginning that you're working with citizens, civil society and business to co-create the solutions that they need. So that's great. Marius, what have you done in Copenhagen? Have you done anything differently to what Jan has done?
I would say I'm very much with Jan here on this issue, but I guess for me, the real value lies in not just working with smart technologies, but actually solving problems. And I guess that's why we're called a solutions lab. So we're not called a tech lab or like a smart city lab. But the idea is actually to make certain that we don't just do pilots or just do sandboxing, especially working closely with industry. It's very dangerous to work with a lot of pilots because at the end of the day, they want to see things go to scale, of course, obviously. And I guess the method that we are employing is making certain that we are only working with these problem spaces that cities are actually willing to invest in, because it's mandatory. We have to be better at reusing our waste. We have to be better at managing traffic. We have to be better at combating bad air. And if you focus solely on these mega problems that needs to be acutely solved in cities, I guess it will go to scale. There will be means of finance. There will be partners that would be interested in being part of solving some of these challenges. Concretely, we're working with a lot of public-private partnership. So a question on the chat function, people were asking about that, and I guess it's a way of making certain that we are not just sitting secluded in the public sector making up stuff, but we're actually going to the solution providers, what would be in the industry, in the private sector, and also in universities, of course. And I guess for us, it's mandatory to make certain then when we are doing development projects that we will have a keen eye on what goes on in the industry and what would be the level of maturity of new technologies, what would be the best companies, big or small, to work with data-driven solutions that could be fitting for a city such as Copenhagen. So I guess on top of being bold, you have to be really focused on what types of problems you're trying to solve. And sometimes I say to my colleagues, I would never just buy sensors and plaster them in the city of Copenhagen, because I don't need sensors. I want to focus on some of these really wicked problems that we have in cities. And if you do that, there will be, at least in my thinking, will be a great opportunity of going to scale and not remaining on the pilot stage.
I'm so glad you said that, because so many cities are guilty of that, right? Just putting sensors in, and they often don't think about the people that don't actually interact with those sensors, who, older persons, for example, or children may not interact with the sensors, so they're not getting the full picture of the population. Could I ask you just a little bit of detail? You mentioned how you leveraged PPPs. So to fully answer the question of David, could I ask you just how you structure that? Is that, that they will sort of, you design, they build, they operate, that they invest, they provide the capital investment, and you share sort of revenues that are generated as a result? So maybe just how do you structure that in the city of Copenhagen, or is each situation different?
It is quite different, I guess, and it also depends on the level of maturity of the technology. Sometimes you have technology that is fairly mature that you can more or less buy. You can go into tendering, and that's not so interesting for us, because that would make us obsolete. But at the other end of the scale, there would be more like immature technologies or problems that are more wicked and more difficult to solve. And I guess if you really find these problems, at least in our understanding, it's possible to build like real partnerships around that. And by real partnerships, I mean partnerships where the private industry and the public sector are investing and jointly trying to solve some of the challenges. So there's not one business model, but I guess for the most successful projects, that it has been the case that the investment has been from both the public and the private sector. Obviously, we are sometimes the problem owner, so we have an obligation to do this or that to have a well-functioning city. But then again, the knowledge around data and technology sits in the private sector, so we need them to take a keen interest in actually not just selling platforms or selling sensors, but actually solving some of these issues together with us in the city administration. That can be quite a fruitful collaboration.
Thank you very much for that. And maybe if I turn to Heng Chee, so how have you got to success in the city of Singapore? You're on mute. Heng Chee, you're on mute.
Yes, I think I'll make the story short and succinct. Alice, the thing about Singapore is that we were very lucky to have a leadership that embraces science and technology. You know, they do not refute science. And not only do they embrace science and technology, the education system, in fact, celebrates science and technology. Some would say too much, you know, but certainly students are given this grounding in science and technology. So people are, in fact, brought up to the level to understand and appreciate this. I would say that the success of Singapore is because the leadership really, the government plans and thinks through everything. We are too small to fail, you know. You don't have many chances. So if you are too small to fail, you really think through very hard. But in truth, I would say we were very top down as a society. And a lot of the solutions and ideas of being smart initiatives came from the top. And around about 10 years ago, I think this awareness that, yes, we've always brought people in, but not enough. So in 2014, there was a very conscious Smart Nation initiative. It's not smart city, but smart nation. How do you bring people in? And certainly you have an aging population, you have those that are not as well to do, they don't have the gadgets, they don't have the computers. How do you bring them into the smart nation? So we've been focused in the last, 6-7 years on working on this aspect, how to level everybody up, you know. Fortunately for Singapore, you mentioned finance, municipal finance. We've been quite good about the reserves. We've accumulated money and we've been prudent. And now is a rainy day, in fact, that is storming, and we are drawing on our reserves. And we are very conscious of that, and that sooner or later taxes will go up, you know. But at the moment, it is okay. So there's finance to cover this particular period. But it is a time when we are working with people. Government wants to bring people into the smart nation, you know, and get them to appreciate what the technology is and to use technology. And COVID, in a funny way, is the ill wind that blows, you know, nobody good. It's the ill wind that has made everybody more conscious about technology and digital stuff, you know. And older people are now far more willing to embrace the technology because they can't go out, they've got to connect with their grandchildren and family. So there's a quick pace. We have also discovered during COVID that about inclusion, and that not everybody, you can talk of online learning, not everybody has a computer. And this is where PPP comes in. And I think we stepped up on PPP during the COVID period as a nation. We found that the low-income families, you couldn't do online learning because they didn't have a computer. So suddenly, government started wanting to buy computers to give to these families, but companies, individuals also came out to donate computers. So it was a collaborative effort. And because the pandemic was such a sudden and, all-encompassing development, and it was, gripping all of us, I think government started working with private, we tend to produce all our solutions. I often say there are too smart civil servants. They're all sitting in the civil service and they come up with their own apps, their solutions, so they don't leave space for anyone else to create. Now, because of COVID, they've had to produce fast. And so there's a lot of collaboration between the private companies, the startups, the medical companies to come up with medical equipment, all kinds of things, tracers, different ways of using technology to track people, four-legged droids to kind of go around the park to push people to keep safe distance, So there's now more PPP, I think, but bear in mind that we are a very centralized city and we are used to a top-down government, but now things are coming, from the ground and people are embracing the technology and taking part. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating the way that you have built capacity right from school age.
Yes, the schools, so, yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's
and even now we are very concerned that the less well-to-do, the low-income children do not fall behind. That is very conscious in the entire population, and I would say that's what COVID has done to us. I once written recently that maybe we've become a kinder, gentler nation, because everyone is aware.
Yeah, fascinating. Carlo, I'm going to turn to you. We have a question in the chat, and it's very much relating to what you originally said about the need for more trial, right? So the question is around how do you balance that with consumer appetite, in terms of risk? So consumers don't want to see failure; they want to see success. So how do you balance the need to experiment with citizens' appetite to risk?
Yeah, well, and I think, thanks a lot for the question. Yes, how citizens can provide feedback, and we can again create this healthy feedback loop of innovation. Now, my impression, however, I disagree a little bit. I was reading the question right now, is that a lot of citizens are really very excited about new innovation. Think about how quickly in most cities people jumped on micromobility, on the scooters, dockless bikes, and so on. So it seems to me that there's certainly a lot of appetite. Sometimes what one could do, that by the way, that was what Sidewalk Labs wanted to do in Toronto, is create a self-select community. So say, maybe not the whole city, you start in a neighborhood. Actually, that's also the way that Singapore has been doing with self-driving cars, selecting a few neighborhoods where already people might be more excited about some innovation and test it there. And then again, you can create a community that knows, that you feel also a bit the pioneer in the broader city ecosystem. So anyway, my impression is that, there is certainly appetite, and that could be managed by actually not doing the whole city at the same time, but trying in different parts of the city. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is related to what we just discussed. And I think I totally agree with what was mentioned by Jan, by Marcus, by Heng Chee. The fact that, we need to involve the private sector in scaling up, that's great. However, in cities all over the world, the way we do procurement or the way we involve the private sector is really the opposite of innovation. Usually when you do procurement, you want to select a private company. The key question the cities ask is, how many times before have you done this? But if you've done it many, many times before, that's not a new thing. That's the opposite of innovation. So somehow, I think the cities all over the world should also think about how to create new PPPs with companies, with the private sector, even in spaces where there's not a lot of historical record, where, where it's something new, is not necessarily copying something that's been done for 10 or 20 years, but trying out something new with a higher risk of failure. And so I think, that's probably one of the important things to do in order to be able to engage the private sector and scale up better with cities and companies.
Very interesting, Carlo. I recall having a conversation with a mayor some time ago, and he was talking about what you were just referring to, about the need to experiment within cities. And he said, at the end of the day, my job is to represent citizens and make policy for the development of that city. And if my citizens don't experience innovation and technology, then they cannot give me feedback on how to design proper policy to enable that innovation and technology within my city. And I thought it was a fascinating way to look at it. We also have a question, and this is a very interesting question. It's, you know, the city of Copenhagen, we know, wants to be carbon neutral by 2025. And the question relates to the fact that technology does give rise to a lot of pollution. And indeed, I remember a conversation with a policymaker, a member of parliament, I should say, in Denmark, who was saying to me about just 3 data centers were increasing electricity consumption within the country by 13%. So just how are you seeking to balance your technology deployment with this overall objective of being carbon neutral, I should say, by 2035, 2025, Marius? I'm mixing up my two cities here.
That's a great question, I guess. So tech is part of the problem and also part of the solution at the same time. So of course we need to balance that. I guess many of the, if not all, but many of the data centers that are located here in, I guess in Scandinavia, but also in Denmark, of course, they are here because we have like green electricity in Denmark from wind turbines primarily. So in that way, it's a less polluting way of making certain that people can store their data in the cloud. But I guess it's very important to be aware of that technology is also creating a lot of problems for us. And I guess that's really the global discussion right now between Brussels and the United States and the rest of the world. So how do we actually make certain that the large corp are part of this discussion on the lesser fortunate parts of the tech industry? In my thinking and in what we're doing in Copenhagen, it's very much about making certain that it's cities that are in the driver's seat. So we shouldn't just go along with any tech suggestion from a large company. We should actually make certain that they are working on the issues that we find most pressing. And I guess that can be a struggle because there's a lot of power and a lot of money and especially a lot of speed in the tech sector. Just commenting on the scooter situation. So actually we don't have scooters in Copenhagen anymore because they were thrown out by our political level. And the reason they were thrown out was primarily because we didn't have a discussion around regulations. So basically they were just like dumped overnight from numerous companies, and they were just cluttering the streets. And I guess that made it like they were moving so fast from these startup companies and tech companies. They didn't really bother to discuss with the political level, and the political level was perhaps a bit insecure on how to encompass this new type of mobility into the mobility mix we already have in place. So because of the difference in speed and because we didn't have that conversation, at the end of the day, we don't have scooters in Copenhagen, and perhaps they could be. I know they are in other cities. They can be part of a mobility mix. So I guess there's a real interesting issue around the speed of technology versus the speed of government and governance. And I guess we need to discuss around that.
Yeah, it's a critical issue. It's not just with scooters, of course. We've seen the same with Airbnb, for example. We've seen the same with Uber. So, you know, when they interrupt the system, there can be a reaction to either try and find a balance and regulate, or in some cases to ban. I'm very conscious that we're coming near to the end of our session. So before I hand back to James, if I could just ask each of you, if you were to give advice to a city leader who was saying, okay, I want my city to adopt and I want to use technology as an enabler, what is the one piece of advice you would give a city leader in terms of trying to get there? And maybe if I start with Heng Chee.
Actually, this question is asked by very many cities in my region, in Southeast Asia. Everyone wants to be smart now. And so we have a smart city network of ASEAN. and each is trying to learn from the other. I think the first thing I would want to say to this mayor or governor is, what problems would you want to solve? And, what are your resources? Then, and who you should consult. And perhaps also look to see where you think, and you can give a few examples of cities that are able to manage resources and technology and to address the problems. And perhaps they could talk to these people. It's not one size fits all.
Thank you, Heng Chee. Carlo?
Yeah, I would say, remember what you've done during the pandemic, where you've taken very bold action and tried something and then, see what worked, what didn't work, basically, remember the trial and error approach and try to continue. And to continue not to respond to the crisis because of the pandemic, but to respond to this increasingly fast wave of urban tech and urban innovation.
Marius?
These are great answers. I want to cover them, but adding to that, I would say, especially when talking about smart city and digital technologies, I would say forget about the digital side or forget about the technology side and start with the problem side and start deciphering what type of city do you want to become, what are your resources, what are your opportunities, and what do your people want, what does the citizens actually want from your city, and then go from there to the technology side.
Thank you. And Jan?
I think that it's important to understand that in the long run, especially, smart cities can only be based on smart people. So my advice is to put emphasis on education and understanding that you need to educate everyone. And I think this is something, a mindset which we share, especially with the city and nation of Singapore. Even if we come from a little bit different cultures, I mean, we have a strong belief in education, and especially in the understanding of educating everyone in the society. And I think this is also an answer to Cheryl's question. I believe that educated people are more curious, and it's a bigger opportunity and probability that they end up to be so-called early adapters as well. So there's a lot of benefits in educating the people.
Thank you. Any final comments, Carlo? No, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I think all of these are really great thoughts, and I would say somehow maybe the final thought is there's a great opportunity, which is to leverage new urban tech to make our cities more livable and lovable. And so we just need to find a way to better capture that opportunity. I think we touched upon many different ways to do it. And so now let's do it.
Thank you, Carlo. So what I've heard today is technology is an enabler, and you need to understand the problem that you want to solve for your citizens before you start thinking about technology. So that was critical. And also we heard of the need to build capacity in our education system and within our city authorities, the need to co-create with citizens, with business, with civil society and academia from the very beginning, and the opportunity to leverage partnerships, for example, public-private partnerships, as well as rethinking procurement to deliver. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor back to James to close out this webinar. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for our wonderful speakers. Thank you for everyone who's participated in this session. James, it's back to you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for contributing. For me, I learned a lot about this, all these issues, and very grateful to hear these comments. I just sort of go through a few of my notes. But Carlo, thank you very much. This idea of trial and error is basically, that's the raison d'etre of the S8nations. Whether it's cities, whether it's healthcare systems, pension funds, etc., we find that these small, smart countries are really at the forefront, and they've arrived at the future first in so many ways, and that's what the whole purpose of this one inaugural webinar is to demonstrate. So thank you very much. Jan, I even sort of felt a sense of competition when you sort of benchmarked Helsinki against Singapore and Copenhagen, which are pretty high bars. So I think that's, again, it's what we want to see, this idea of looking at other examples, looking over the garden hedge and trying to learn from what other people are doing. Your point about getting stakeholders involved, and Marius's point with the scooter is a fantastic example of not just positive innovations, but sometimes adverse innovations that need to be corrected and remedied. So I thought that was really interesting. I really appreciate Marius sharing with, sort of conveying the idea that this, there's lots of aspirational goals and people talk about all kinds of future things. But I kind of have the feeling that this 2025 CO2 neutrality is real and can be achieved, and it would be interesting to learn more about that. But I really had the impression that it's not just a dream; it's specific steps and specific milestones. And I just wanted to say that we need you. We need Copenhagen to succeed. We need someone to blaze the path, and then for us to then, learn from your experience and try to get there quicker. So thank you very much, and bravo on that front. And then, Heng Chee, dare to change. That's exactly what we're trying to do. So thank you for reminding that. So I think we should all just close our eyes and sort of imagine what the sort of city we want to have to attract talented, engaging, resourceful people. So thanks for letting us do that. Our next webinar is about pension funds. Mercer just came out with the ranking of the best pension funds in the world. It's the Danes #1, Dutch #2, Singapore, Switzerland, Canada, etc. So again, these small adaptive countries are showing the way. And then we'll be doing other webinars around other topics that we think are of high relevance for everyone. So thank you, and thank you again, Alice. Julia, thank you very much for organizing that, and wishing everyone a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.